So guys, welcome to the first webinar for this year's Sustainable Cities course. In this week, the first module highlights the urban opportunity of the 21st century and explores how cities are unique with their own set of economic, political, historical and cultural systems. Today we'll listen and interact with Aromar Revi. Aro is the Director of IHF and has been a senior advisor to various ministries of Government of India, consulted with a wide range of multilateral, bilateral development and private sector institutions, and works on economic, environmental, and social change at various scales. So we'll start this webinar by first listening to Aro for about 10 minutes, and in the meanwhile, we encourage you to please post in your thoughts, comments, questions in the chat box for us to review later. Also, if there's any issue with sound quality or video quality, please do post it on the chat box so that we can fix it as we go. Thanks. Over to you.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're expecting a lot of you from different parts of the world. So I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Aromar Revi, like Vinita has just said. I'm the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, which is based in India. We work on transforming India's development opportunities, especially looking at how cities and urbanization can happen. But I also work with colleagues from across the world, pretty much in every continent, to try and see what we can do about the implementation of sustainable development, especially using this megatrend that we've seen evolving over the last, let's say, 50 years or so, where more and more of us are living in cities, more than half the world's population at the current point of time. But more important than that, a very significant fraction of the world's economy coming from urban areas. And when I say urban areas, it's not only large metropolitan cities like Mumbai or Tokyo or New York, but also, most importantly, at the current point of time, what we call secondary cities and smaller towns. Because the bulk of the new things that are going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years is going to actually happen in these smaller places, especially in Asia, where China has led the way in sort of massive process of transformation from the late 80s, early 1990s, which is sort of more or less built it out to become the single largest economy in the world. And much of that is driven by its process of urbanization, its transformation of its economy, and of course, its sort of larger engagement with the world. We have colleagues who worked on looking at this question, especially in Latin America, because starting in the 1930s, 40s, and building up over the 50s to 70s, Latin America made a tremendous transition from being rural in many parts of in many parts of many countries to becoming what I would call hyper-urban. Most Latin American countries over a relatively short period of time, unlike Europe or North America, are now at 80 or 90% urbanization. We see that building out over South Asia, and then of course the future in some senses is in Africa. I was in Durban just last week, and we were discussing the really interesting things that are happening, both deep challenges in some senses, but also the opportunity that African urbanization is going to provide, not only to people across the continent, and there are a large number of countries there, but also for the rest of the world. As we see new forms of innovation, a whole range of new cultural processes, and of course, the opportunity for a better life, living conditions, and working conditions across many parts of the world. So this is a big shift and change, and we've designed this course and brought together some of the world's leading urbanists to try and get a sense of what it means in the contemporary world. Since the process of developing these sustainable development goals of UN sort of have kicked off, it's almost 4 years. In fact, it's pretty much 5 years since a number of us presented, and I was there at the General Assembly in 2014 to try and convince the countries of the world that we have to look at things a little bit differently in the 21st century. We have to look at a whole range of different challenges, and innovation coming from civil society, from people's movements, from local governments across the world, who are trying now to find solutions to things that are much bigger than the particular areas they're looking at. And in some ways, we hope we're going to see significant changes in the framework of governance, on where resources are going to flow, and what kind of power and opportunities cities can provide to their citizens, and of course, in their relationship with nation states, with firms and the international system over the next 15 or 20 years. So over these few weeks, we're going to try and explore this entire landscape, looking at cities as systems of systems, looking at them from multiple points of view, from economic, social, and environmental lenses, and running this on multiple tracks in different locations. So I guess we are very glad that you're with us, and hope that you can stay with us till the end of this process and get a deep and rich understanding of this remarkable world of transformation that cities and urban areas across the world are providing to us.
Right. So we'll go on to our questions now, and the first question is from Richard, and he writes that his city has recently reviewed transportation routes for more efficient travel. So how far do you think practices like this can contribute to a sustainable living in the city, and what more can be done?
Transportation is a very critical theme, or let's say, the word that we use typically is mobility more than transportation, because transportation seems to be very fixated on the idea that you have a vehicle and people move from one place to the other. But in actual fact, people have moved themselves across cities for many thousands of years. And in fact, the most livable cities of the world, whether you look at them in Europe or Latin America or Australia or North America, and in parts of Asia, are places where people are able to walk in some senses. So there's this whole interesting thing that we deal with, which is what's more important, having a whole range of people moving back and forth and spending hours moving from one part of the city or the other, or improve mobility and access. Now, transportation systems are quite important because, especially over the last 150 years, as the industrial cities have grown, they've, in a sense, had defined city structure. And one of the most important sort of underlying assumptions that people have about modern cities that are there is that you have vehicles like the car, you have mass transit systems, which use a lot of energy to actually function. Now, the challenge with that view of the world is that it often leads to cities that become very large, that sprawl. You have cities like Johannesburg or even other parts of the world, which they expand well beyond the bounds of that process. So the challenge is particular forms of transportation actually define urban structure, and that urban structure in turn leads to both exclusion in some cases. So if you have a car, it's wonderful, you can move from one place to the other. But if you're a poor person in a city like New Delhi, which I spend a lot of time in, then you either walk to work, or if you're lucky, you're riding a bicycle. So in a sense, inequality and a whole range of other processes get encoded into the framework of the city. So one of the, in some senses, the iron laws of transportation is the more roads you build, the more cars that will fill them, and more, in some senses, the more congestion you'll have. So dealing with questions of productivity, dealing with questions of equity, and questions of sustainability in terms of energy are tied to how the transport networks actually build out and organize cities. So looking at that is an important question, but I think we have to go well beyond the sort of current modernist paradigm. There's a wonderful example that I take from Perth, where they've replaced a very large highway with a let's say a tram or a mass transit route. So using shared transportation, using public transport in many parts of the world actually makes cities much more effective to manage, much better places for them to live in. But it requires a certain mindset which we kind of lost, and in some ways has been taken over by the idea that freedom in the car are the great ways of the future. But in a world that's going beyond oil, a world that has to get to 1.5 degrees in terms of climate, these are ideas of the past. And as China is showing us with their transition to electric vehicles and denser urban form, I think the cities of the early and mid 21st century in many places are going to look very different from what we've seen in some parts of let's say, of the US, cities like Houston, cities that have just gone out and have sprawled indefinitely, and in some ways are hence quite unsustainable.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in from the YouTube chat, and the first one is from Abhijit. How important will be peri-urban areas or peri-urban nodes for villages in the hinterland as well as urban cities? And he's asking with Indian cities in mind.
So the process of urbanization that Abhijit is talking about is an interesting one. Now, typically, we have to look at urban systems in a systematic way. So we look at an urban system starting from small villages and hamlets, building out to larger towns, and you then get even larger intermediate and secondary cities, then maybe million cities, and then finally metropolises in some particular locations. So when we're looking at the spatial organization of how people live and how economies are organized, there's a hierarchy that sort of develops in some senses. But the hierarchies are different in different parts of the world for a whole range of reasons. One of them, which sort of is, I guess, embedded in the question that you're asking, are tied to the structure of the economy, in a sense. How many people are employed in agriculture and primary activities and hence tend to live in villages? How many people are sort of employed in manufacturing, and how many people are employed in services? Because pretty much across the world, you find that a lot of manufacturing and much of services are situated inside urban areas. So the transition from an agrarian to an industrial to a post-industrial service-based economy is often accompanying the process of urbanization and the location of people. So the question of how peri-urban areas are being organized and how they're managed is very central to that. Because in some parts of the world which are very dense, like you asked a question about India, you have people everywhere. So when the city expands or its boundary expands, it is about sort of incorporating villages and lands that are outside the city in the peri-urban areas inside the urban fabric. That's why in India and other parts of Asia, you have this, or even China, you have this very interesting, contradiction. In the middle of large metropolitan areas like, a city like Xi'an or Beijing or, many Indian cities, you find what are called urban villages. These are former villages which had lands around them that were agricultural maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, which have got incorporated into the urban fabric. The village structure still exists, but the occupations and the basis on which people lived has completely changed. So the question there is, how do you actually manage these processes and bring them together? How do you keep the balance between the rural, the urban, and the peri-urban in a world in which these boundaries are actually shifting very significantly? So some of this is just categorization, but in actual fact, there are deep cultural and economic differences. And we deal with that through a process of, regional planning. And, I worked on this many years ago on trying to look at the question of how one balances the rural and the urban and maintains that continuum. And I guess it requires a different way of thinking about space, about economic geography, and about the relationship between economic activity and things like mobility that we were talking about earlier. So particular kinds of economies produce particular kinds of urban hierarchies. And some of them are more inclusive than others. Some of them are more productive than others. And I hope we will try and touch on these questions as we proceed through this course.
Right. So our next question is from Kenneth, and he is asking how should cities be dealing with the problem of overpopulation, and how technologies could help with this issue.
So Kenneth, the question of what is overpopulation or not is a very relative one. So if you come from a country like Canada, which has a relatively small population, a huge landmass, even a city of maybe 30, 40,000 or 50,000 seems large. In Asia, they would be counted as villages. So, it's all about how one looks at the number of people and population densities. And, this idea that people are a challenge is a real one. And sometimes it becomes very obvious when you're working in situations where basic services and poverty is sort of rampant. But the fact is, what we're learning more and more, and this is what cities are all about, they're all about providing opportunities for people to actually change their lives and transform the world around them. So if we start looking at people as as an opportunity, then I think we would look at this question a little bit differently. We wouldn't talk about population. We'd look at densities and see, is the density of whatever it is, let's say 10,000 persons per hectare, too much, or is it 1,000? You can relate that to what kind of natural resources there are, what kind of economic activity there could be, is there enough renewable energy potential for that place to deal with it from the resource point of view. But the fact is that urban areas agglomerate people, they bring them together because of the great opportunities they create in terms of just economies of scale. It's much more effective when people live together. Infrastructure is cheaper, economic activity becomes much more productive, and that, in a sense, helps sort of agglomerate. But the other side of it is it also concentrates a whole range of other things. So, we've started having, if you look at the history of cities, we have both famines and plagues because people concentrate in particular areas. And, if you are, let's say, a particular virulent virus like smallpox or the plague, you need large populations of people in concentrated areas to actually survive. And in effect, many of the things that are really difficult to deal with in public health actually only happen because of the concentration that cities provide us. So, there's an interesting balance there of too little people and too many people. And, that's the interesting trade-off when we try and deal with the management and development and transformation of urban areas. That we have to look at all dimensions. And obviously, population is important. But there are other things that are important also, looking at the resource flows around that, looking at sort of biodiversity elements. And so, there are also populations. So it's not only a human-centric view we have to take, we have to look at a whole range of other things, including other species on whom we depend and who, in a sense, co-evolve in the city with us.
We have another question regarding transportation here from Yoginder. And he would like to know which mobility mode is more sustainable. Is it train, metro, BRT? What's more sustainable?
Well, sustainability doesn't work only in a single dimension, right? So it depends on context. So in many parts of the world, for cities that are 100,000 to 1 million plus, BRT systems are actually quite good. So I would say let's start with the heuristic. The first thing is, if cities are walkable, they're actually nice places to live in, and if they're walkable and they can actually enable a whole range of economic activity and social engagement, that's a good way to actually sort of manage to build them. And we have examples from them all over the world, very often historical cities. But as urban design sort of embraces sustainability, you find that happening in many parts of the world, including in the United States, in Europe, and I've seen wonderful places in Australia, and of course we have a long history of doing this in parts of Asia and Africa. So it's a context-dependent thing. It depends on the size of the city, its dimensions in some senses, and the amount of people who have to move back and forth. So if you have a place that has a lot of mixed use, then people don't have to chase around from one part of the city to the other, right? But if you have places that are very highly zoned, and you have to move people tens of kilometers, then obviously you have to use a mass transit system if there are large numbers of people moving back and forth, let's say in the morning and the evening, in a service-driven kind of economy where you have a center that does, let's say, finance in one place and people residing somewhere else, or you have a place that has a lot of sprawl. So it's very contextual, but obviously the key thing is, you have to use much less resources to move people around. As far as mobility is concerned, the less you move, the better it is. And of course, now we have the alternative options of people working, remotely. The displacement of transportation, because at one end we can use the internet and a whole range of other technologies to interface and deal with that. Plus, logistics are also changing. So that itself, as logistics change in many parts of the world, and you don't necessarily have to go to places to buy things; it actually comes to you. The structure and function of mobility is going to change. And I think when we're talking about transportation systems, we must always remember that cities are places in which people live. And when people live, they consume things. They need food, they need goods, they need a whole range of other stuff. So we can't only look at the physical movement of people. The movement of things is also very important. And we have to look at it holistically. So a particular mode of transport that may be very efficient for one kind of thing, like moving people, may be actually not very good for moving goods. So we have to look at those systems together. We have to look at how we reduce their energy use. We have to look at how efficient they are in terms of resource use, what their life cycle costs are like, to be able to answer the question of sustainability. It's a multidimensional question. There's no single answer, and that's why you have transportation planners and designers working to try and find the best mix of modes that work for a particular urban area or even a region in some senses. Because regional mobility is sometimes an important thing. If you look at a region like the Bay Area, near San Francisco, you have a regional transportation system, or even larger metropolitan areas where you have to deal with things that are involved more than one city.
We have a question on urban poverty next from Mimi, and she's asking that she says that she visited India once and was surprised to see a large number of homeless and beggars. And what do you think is the solution for this? Yeah.
Well, India has the largest population of poor people in the world. So the obvious thing is that we have to do something about development. And as you people will learn over the course of this course, SDG 1 is all about poverty. So people come to cities, whether they're homeless or they're beggars, many of them, because of economic opportunity. Of course, some people have other issues and whatever. But the interesting thing, of course, and we'll probably show it to you sometime later in the course, we have a wonderful image of somebody who's homeless and a dog and sitting in the middle of London. So, this is an idea which, as we traverse the world, we'll find that when we talk about the global south also exists in the global north. Many of the OECD countries now experience very severe poverty. You can go to some of the richest cities in the world, and you will find people. In fact, at the current point in time, New York is going through, like many other cities in the US, is going through a huge challenge in terms of this cold wave because of this Arctic freeze that's happening. You will find people living on the street, sometimes with sleeping bags and sometimes without. It's the same thing pretty much across the world. So it's about the opportunities for work. It's about inequality in urban areas. It's about access to adequate housing and how inclusive urban areas are about. So in some parts of the world, there is, within quotes, the right to the city, where people actually have the right to be able to live and work in adequate conditions. There's a special UN agency that kind of tries to look at these questions. So this is a universal question, and with the way the world is growing, especially with growing inequality, this is something that we're going to see in many parts of the world. It's obviously something that we have to do something about. It's a very critical question, and especially where people are living out significant portions of their lives in conditions of homelessness. This is, I would say, one of the first charges for us when we're talking about sustainable development, because it is about ensuring that no person is left behind, and this is the extreme in some senses.
Right. So the next question is from Surena and from Nepal, Kathmandu city actually. And this question was also on the discussion forum that sparked some pretty interesting discussions there. And the question is primarily that there's a massive road widening sort of developmental project that's happening there, and which is tearing down a lot of indigenous families and cultural heritage of the city. So how do you think this issue can be approached? Maybe you could explain it as an example.
Yeah, I mean, Serena, I've sort of spent some time in Kathmandu. I've seen it grow many years. I lived there when I was much younger in the 60s, and it's changed dramatically. And in fact, the whole valley has changed dramatically. So of course, maybe we can't answer this question directly because I can't talk to you, but which parts of the city are you talking about? One of the things that we may see here is this because of what's happened after the earthquake that hit the valley a few years ago, and that becomes an opportunity then to sort of redevelop and redesign things. But given the history of a city like Kathmandu, the inner city areas, or even looking at Patan, for example, I think it's central to both the identity and culture of the Nepali people, or the people who live in the valley, to be able to see where they've come from and where their cultural roots are. Now, in some cases, it doesn't always work that way. You can't completely have the entire city fabric organized there, but it's very important for us to be able to try and preserve and engage with a living fabric as it exists. And that's my sense of at least some parts of Kathmandu. It's tied into a living fabric. It's not something that which is a dead area, which is a dead zone, which real people are living there. There's commerce, there's activity. It's rich and it's vibrant, etc. So part of this challenge happens because of particular visions of how the city is to be organized and managed. So if you go back, this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, Paris was completely rebuilt and torn down in the 1860s and 70s by Baron Haussmann because they had a particular challenge. There was in a sense, there was an insurrection. There was an uprising against the French Empire at that point in time. The city of Paris formed the first commune. And in a sense, the barricades were what really, and these narrow streets was what actually enabled the first commune of Paris to actually take over and run the city for the city speed at the time. So from the point of view of order and the elites, they essentially tore, and what you see today, the grand sort of avenues in Paris and the redevelopment, the areas which we look at and say, this is a remarkable place, was actually very different. It was torn down and rebuilt. There were many challenges in actually doing that. But it came from a particular vision, which was a vision of order, a vision that was driven by a particular kind of elite. And we see that even in other contexts. When Chairman Mao stood on the ramparts of the Forbidden City in 1949, and he sort of declared, the creation of a new communist republic in China, one of the first things that he did, and if you see the photographs at that point of time, when you look down from the Forbidden City, you have a whole range of areas that were traditional, and they still exist in some parts of the city called hutongs. And then, of course, there was a city wall. So one of the first things that he did was actually to demolish the city wall. So if you go into Beijing just now, at one end of Tiananmen Square, you still have the remainder of the city gate. And there are many gates that are there. Many of the metro stations are tied to gates. But it comes from a particular view of how the city is organized and constructed. And I think in parts of the world, there's a great recognition that the living heritage and fabric is a very important part of the continuity of what we are and what we can be. And in many ways, they may speak to an earlier time and age. For example, when I go to Beijing, I typically don't stay in these fancy hotels. I prefer to live in a hotel because it gives us a much better sense of what life is. It gives you a sense of everyday life in China, which somebody from the outside may not have the opportunity to actually see and experience. And that's true for many other places. There's something about scale and engagement. It might be quaint in some senses. It may not be very productive. But I think there's something in us that actually tries to relate to that. And if you go back to some of the classic work on design, Christopher Alexander's work in the Times Square building, it is these patterns that are very, very important. And it's a great loss to tear these things down. But the fact is, large metropolitan areas have a lot of people, and if you privilege cars over people and local fabric, then you have to find a place for cars. But the question, of course, is if you're looking at sustainability and trying to be inclusive, is how do you balance out the need for, let's say, movement and particular forms of modernism with what's happening. And of course, in many cases, the fabric may be poorly serviced, the buildings may be actually quite old, they may be dangerous, which is one of the reasons why I'm saying after an earthquake, you find a lot of this redevelopment taking place because the administration says, look, these are dangerous buildings, they're hazardous, so let's take them down. But there may be other things at play, including real estate interests, land markets, and a whole range of other processes. So we often have to, pierce the veil and look and see what's sitting behind that to get a sense of what the options are. But there are many places in the world where, both of these things can work together, and we can try and keep a good balance. That's what good design and planning is about in some senses.
Falguni has an interesting question, and she asks, why are words like development and progress repeated in cities only? In the videos also, cities were said to be synonymous with development. Are people of villages with self-sustaining, are there villages with self-sustaining systems?
Of course, yeah. I mean, in fact, there's an entire let's say, a domain of practice and, of course, theory, which is all about rural development. Because till very recently, most people lived in villages in many countries, especially in South Asia and Africa, etc. There are many more people, a larger proportion of people who live in villages than urban areas. So you can't really develop as a society or a country without actually, transforming rural areas. So in a sense, I think, that might be a false dichotomy in some senses, that everything seems to be about urban development. That's not true at all. I mean, I've spent 35 years working on rural development. I also work on urban development. Actually, these are categories that don't necessarily completely work for all of us because they're different places in some senses. I think we have to be a little bit more critical of some of the terms and the ideas that come to us and look at how we can interrogate them and see what's what's sitting around them. So when we're talking about sustainable development, and we're talking about human settlements and sustainable communities, it's everybody, everywhere. It's not only people in large metropolitan centers who are swank and have cars and can travel by aeroplanes and that kind of other stuff. And villages have many nice things about them, but they also have horrible things. In many parts of the world, there are places which are very exclusionary, especially in terms of gender. In some parts of the world, based on class or ethnicity or religion. So there's a mix of these things, and one has to be able to distinguish them and try and deal with how one will try and address them in a as holistic a manner as possible.
So Louis would like to know, how can the new urban agenda, Habitat 3 guidelines, be better known and incorporated into urban planning in cities around the world?
Louis, that's a very interesting question. The new urban agenda came through a long process of discussion, and it was sort of released in Quito almost around four years ago. The interesting thing that happened, because there were so many other things that were happening over 2015 and 16, is the agenda is known to people in the urban sphere, but maybe not people outside. The Sustainable Development Goals, because they were much wider, they were involved a much larger community of national and international leaders and development practitioners are somewhat better known. So I think there are 2 or 3 things that we need to do. The first thing, of course, is to try and build the linkage between the Sustainable Development Goals and the new urban agenda. They actually have a number of points of contact, though I would say the goals are much more focused. They're about actually getting things done in a particular point of time in the next 12 years or 11 years to be precise. The agenda is more philosophical. It has a whole range of things. It talks about the process of urbanization in cities in a much more holistic manner. It has lots of different things on it. And when you're dealing with policy, when you're dealing with making trade-offs, or as somebody who runs a large or a small firm, you're often dealing with things that are very concrete. So having nice principles and philosophical discussions are good. They're part of strategy, but people need to know or would like to know a lot about how things can be done, how they can be financed, who's going to do things, how quickly can they be organized. And the NUA is a little bit, let's say, weak in that space. But there are 40 countries in the world that are working on something which is, I would say, a core pillar of the NUA, and that is on national urban policies. UN Habitat and a whole range of other agencies are helping to do that. So in some senses, the national urban policies provide you a framework where you can actually link what's happening at the household and neighborhood level through multiple processes, through the city, through the region, and to the country, and try and look at how implementation and actual processes can work with them. We're hoping that other questions that the NUA actually brought up around financing, about participation, about, let's say, housing, and there's a big debate about that in many parts of the world. Some parts of the world believe that the right to housing is a fundamental right. Other parts of the world are not so sure about that. So there are lots of interesting contests, and it's a very diverse environment that we're talking about. So, you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution, even within a large, let's say, country like Brazil. There'll be different things that will be happening in the Northeast and other things happening in the South, because the contexts are different. So the NUA gives us a broad frame to think about that, but eventually it's the countries, it is the regions, the cities that have to operationalize this. And I think that's a space that we are struggling with in many parts of the world.
How important would it be to emphasize community participation in order to enhance social tissue for a land equity process in peripheral neighborhoods in a growing city? What's the next question?
Yeah, I mean, people are central to this process. So the idea of community participation in some parts of the world is a little bit odd. If the citizens of the country are sovereign or the city are sovereign, why would they need to participate? And that comes from a particular view in which, let's say, the state, in some cases, in other places, maybe the private sector, is very strong. And in a sense, what the state does and the way the state thinks and works defines what actually happens, not only in the development agenda and what happens in the urban space, but what actually happens in the lives of both communities and people. So so that's where this idea comes from, and even in other places it's changing. So to give you a concrete example, so China has historically had, especially after the revolution, a situation in which in urban areas land has historically been owned by the state, at least most of the land. And in village areas, because they had communes, the ownership of land was never with individuals, it was with the community. Now, the interesting question is, when a metropolitan area expands, and we were just talking about peri-urban areas a little while ago, what happens when the edge of a metropolis or edge of the city actually hits a village? And what happens to land transformation in that context? Who decides? It's obviously a system in which ownership is not individual. In cities, it's only recently that people can actually have individual ownership. But what happens is that interface between the village community and the urban government? And lots of interesting questions that are there. People who work on land relations in China, even though that's an exceptional situation for many other parts of the world. So, communities are very central to these questions because, I guess one is the question of rights and, who has agency. And the other question is, if you have to solve a particular problem in a particular place, why would somebody from somewhere far away actually be effective in actually doing that? And in some senses, the idea of devolution, the idea of inclusion is about trying to solve local problems locally and only deal with things that are more complex as they go to higher levels of engagement. So, for example, if you're looking at water running across a landscape, you can't only deal with that locally. So rivers are running from one place to the other, there are upstream and downstream issues, and you have to all come together to deal with that. But if you're dealing with what's happening in a particular locality or a village or a town, the question is, why should people from the outside be necessarily involved in defining everything? They're important to have to bring them into discussion because there are things that move back and forth. There are questions of jurisdiction, there are questions of governance. So in that sense, communities can be central to the process, and especially for social questions. What we find in many parts of the world is they're absolutely central to addressing them, because when you take things to a much higher level of aggregation, even though democracy is a great thing, in actual problem-solving kind of situations, communities can become much more important.
Our next question is from Ravi Kumar, who would like to know your thoughts on minimalism and its relation to sustainable urbanization, and which country is leading in the minimalist living right now.
So I'm assuming when you talk about minimalist, you're talking about a limited consumption of resources, because in architectural planning, that minimalism means something else. So we have a small planet. Unfortunately, there are too many of us on it. There are close to 8 billion people, and because now we're increasingly connected, people know what other people do and what they live like. So there's this appreciation that everybody can live this good life in which they can consume an awful lot of resources and own an awful lot of things. Now the fact is that's not possible, partially because the biosphere just cannot support it, and secondly because economic development and the development trajectories don't actually allow that to happen. So I would say that there are two kinds of I could characterize it as two kinds of minimalism. One, of course, is that you come from a very rich country, typically in northeastern Europe, and there you can afford to use a bicycle, you can do a whole bunch of things because the per capita income of the country is about 40,000, 50,000, 100,000, or somewhere between that dollars per capita. So you can afford to be minimalistic. You can afford to try and cut down your consumption. You can afford to actually embrace a whole range of things because you're rich enough to do that. Not all cultures do that. Many of them actually consume more and more, and with obvious outcomes. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you have people who have very little in their lives because they're extremely poor. They live off the land, and they don't have many options as far as they're concerned. So they're forced to live with very little. And in that sense, if you go to a village in many parts of the world, or even in informal settlements in other places, you go inside the house, look at the resources that people have. They're very little because their options are quite limited. And then there are people in between that who actually make the choice of living with very little. That comes from a question of values. Sometimes it's driven by social and political movements. In India, we have the Gandhian movement that actually celebrated this. And sort of try to address the question of how much is enough. So they're both ethical and sometimes faith-based reasons why people don't consume much or do very much. That's kind of, that's up to where you are and what you're doing. But the fact is that there's certainly limits to what the planet can handle. There are limits to what your local environment can deal with. And if you put out a lot of muck into the environment, you get air pollution, you get water pollution, you get sick. And that's a terrible thing to happen. And especially for people who have less resources, it's even worse than those that have other things. So we really have to look very carefully at sustainable production and consumption, both the changing our production systems and how much we consume, because some of the stuff is actually unnecessary. You can live a very decent and a happy life without having to have a whole lot of things at your beck and call and a whole lot of things you don't actually.
So we'll quickly move on. I think there are a lot of questions that are waiting. So do you think there is a way that we can harness activities from the informal economies in cities and emerging cities so that they service both the formal economy and the poorer city population?
I don't think we have to harness it. That's the reality in many cities in the global south. 90% of the employment, a quarter or half the value addition in many large metropolitan and urban centers across the global south comes from what is called the informal sector. Actually, the informal sector is a little bit of a lazy category. It contains a whole range of other things. But the fact is, just because somebody lives in conditions which are not so adequate doesn't mean that they actually are not productive. In fact, they actually carry the burden of production of services in most of our cities across the world. So even in the large metropolitan centers, whether it's migrant workers who are coming in providing services, or people who are not so well off actually running the core city functions, informality is certainly part of many urban economies. The challenge, of course, is what is the relationship between informality and decent work, and the right to a full life. And I think, or even just simple questions of personal safety and hygiene. Effectively, the challenge is that a lot of poor people who work very hard, some of them 2 or 3 shifts, actually subsidize the well-off people in the city by their quality of life. And they may not have a choice from where they come from or the kind of social or economic circumstances they have. So in some senses, I would say informal sector and engaging with the informal economy and informal employment is one of the most critical questions that we address. And we have a whole sort of segment that deals with this. We have some of the best people in the world who work on this question, including Renaya Chabara, who helps manage one of the largest women's unions in the world, who are actually working on addressing these questions and harnessing this energy. But it's not only for the rich people, it's for all of us.
Right. Ashlesha would like to ask, public participation plays an important role in the process of development of cities. How can that be triggered with respect to Indian cities? Perhaps we could give examples of good public participation examples from India.
Well, I think the most dramatic example of public participation in India was the movement, a few years ago, to deal with corruption. And it's not only in India that you see that. You see that all across the Arab Spring so-called countries, whether it's, look at what happened in Cairo, you see what happened in Istanbul, etc., etc. So, again, like I said, this question of participation is a slightly mixed one. So when citizens actually get up to, express their concerns or actually demonstrate or stand up and say, look, this is not how we like things to be, or we want to do things differently. Some people see that as a break on law and order. Obviously, if it becomes violent, it becomes exploitative or whatever it is, it's an issue. But is that not a form of public participation? Are just sort of sanitized community meetings around every corner to have a discussion about things which don't really make much difference? That's the only form of participation that you can see. So one has to look at these categories a little bit carefully. We look at them in the latter section of the course, where you talking to practitioners who are actually working with communities. We have Shira Patel, who is the head of institution that has really built a movement of people in informal settlements, not only in the global south but in other parts of the world, who talks about how this is much more than just a question of participation. It's a question of rights. It's a question of dignity. It's a question of being able to be an equal citizen in some senses, even though you may not have the same kind of resources as somebody else. That's the whole thing about political democracies. One thing that makes us all equal is the fact that we are citizens, irrespective of our social circumstance, irrespective of our accidents of birth. Give us the opportunity to do different things than nowadays.
There's a follow-up question on participation. Which effective participation methods can be used to ensure the inclusion of spatially disadvantaged areas, example townships, so that they also reap from the positive of the urban development?
So the first thing is you have to recognize citizenship. So one of the big challenges we see in many parts of the world is that city governments, in some cases, other forces, could be market forces, real estate, view some people as not necessary in the city and as people who can be displaced. So if you look at forced evictions, for example, in many parts of the world, it comes from that appreciation that some people are illegal residents and should actually. And of course, there are different ways of viewing the world, and I think we have a lot to learn from countries in Latin America who in the last 20 or 30 years have completely altered our view of what informality, what squatting, what forms of urban engagement actually mean. In fact, in a country like Brazil, it led to the Statute of Cities, which has created a framework, and a legal framework, let's say, which empowers people to actually participate in the day-to-day activity of cities. And it goes even further, where you have participatory budgeting, where in community in a place or city sits down and at least a certain part of the municipal budget, they actually decide what the priorities are instead of having somebody else decide that for them. So pretty much across the world, I would say, there are movements to be able to enable and empower individuals and communities to be able to voice their own concerns, to decide their own priorities, and actually deal with the day-to-day act of living in an urban area. Littering, for example, is a classic problem all over the world, and where communities are strong, people don't litter because as citizens they pick it up. This is a public space, or this is your city, so they don't allow that to happen. If you go and look at metro systems in many parts of the world, the city may be filthy, but the metros themselves, because they in some senses symbolize all that is good and modern, if you use quotes, in the city, are places which are much better managed. So I think there is a whole range of questions about the public and the private, and who has agency and who doesn't, which opens up a whole range of questions of what are the tools that enable this to happen. Do you have institutional spaces to make this happen? I think if those of you who've heard Edgar Peterson speak, Edgar speaks about this into the public and private in dealing with this cube of power question that's there. So these are ideas that we use to try and understand these processes and phenomena, but they become very stark especially when inequality becomes sort of difficult to manage, and people will stand up and say this is enough is enough.
Right. On that same note, Bhavya has another question on: are there any examples, perhaps, on more active citizen participation to actually impact policy versus a top-down approach controlled by governments and professionals?
So, governments are, in many parts of the world at least, not everywhere, are in theory put into place by a process of franchise. So, you elect your governments. The elections may or may not be completely fair or democratic. You elect your government and somebody comes to represent you. The challenge, of course, often is that form of representation, because of the social structure, the political structure, is either intermittent or non-existent, or is it focuses on the interests of a particular interest group. So part of the challenge of trying to enable a more inclusive urban system is how this process of representation or direct representation actually works itself out. So, Switzerland, for example, uses a system of referendums, which would be very dangerous in other parts of the world, as we're seeing through the process of Brexit, because referendums have great advantage when we're used to doing them, but they can have somewhat challenging consequences in other areas. I just gave you the example of participative budgeting, where communities are able to sit down and figure out what their priorities are, what resources they should use. In most places let's say many places of the world, you can't actually expropriate somebody's private property, not only because of the law, because you have to go through a due process of public consultation. If you take a particular area where let's say there is a park and you convert it into something else, you're taking away a public good or a public asset, which people are not going to be very thrilled with. Similarly, when there's significant changes that you see in the urban fabric, like Madrid and other cities in Europe, like Milan, engage in a process of significant urban greening. Now, how could that happen? That can happen because communities get together and say, okay, we will plant not only in our homes and our own private plots, so to speak, but in public parks and spaces that have been taken over and are falling apart. And that snowballs, and that becomes a movement where there's a partnership that develops between the government, the local government, between people who finance them from, let's say, local industry, and citizens who actually plant the trees and look after them. So we have to try and look for these kind of intermediate kind of relationships and partnerships to try and move this agenda of sustainability further. It has to be very practical, simple, and doable in everyday life.
Speaking of green cover, we missed a question on urban farming among all these participatory questions. And Yogendra would like to know what is the view on urban farming in cities to make itself some part of self-sufficient in food supply?
Well, urban agriculture is a very good idea. It's difficult to become self-sufficient pretty much in every part of the world because, cities are dense concentrations of people. There are very limited areas for you to go something like food grain. So, for a city to be self-sufficient in, let's say, rice or wheat, etc., would be very, 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 very difficult. But a significant amount of the nutritional requirements of the city can actually be grown inside the city. This has been well demonstrated. I mean, pretty much everywhere in the world where there's a war, there's conflict, and the city is under siege, people grow their own food, and a large proportion of, let's say, their fruits and vegetables and things like that. It also makes a big difference to poor people because it allows you access to nutrition and a let's say, potentially better balanced diet if you're able to do it. There's another factor which people often don't sort of cognize, and that is we bring in lots of food into the city. Okay, as people, we throw them out as waste, either as food waste or excrete it. It goes out and becomes a huge problem inside our water, inside our soils, and a whole range of other things. If you're able to sort of recycle those nutrients, as Chinese urban areas have done for a millennia and a half, you actually get a very sophisticated form of ecological production in which the nutrients that are coming into the city are actually recycled, and your load on the environment and your ability to produce good things are actually quite good. It also makes a lot of difference in terms of local employment and job creation. As you see, in more, let's say, better off parts of the world, farmers markets are places where, the premium of the products that come from. Of course, in poorer parts of the world, farmers markets are the way that farmers can actually come in and sell and buy. So depending on the context, urban agriculture has a great future. I think, more of us do need to be able to try and grow things. Especially if you are engaged and happy with slow food and good food, instead of things that are mass produced in industrial agriculture, which are driven by fossil fuels and a whole range of chemicals, this is an interesting way forward. And I think some of the better cities in the world have really embraced this very strongly. And other parts of the world where the rural and the urban economies are much better tied together, they don't really have to, they're not challenged very much. If you look at the city of Kolkata, for example, the wetlands of Kolkata produce from the sewage of the city some of, much of the city's, a lot of the city's fish, and a lot of the fruits and vegetables. And they also provide employment for 150 to 200,000 people. So, there's a win-win all around. But our conception of what an urban area is and its relationship with the countryside, with other economic activity, is something that we have to maybe change.
Our next question is from Lewis, and he says that in metropolitan cities with already so many complex problems, how do you prioritize among a high diversity of citizens, poverty settlements, in urban fringe, mobility, congestion, delays, etc.? How do you prioritize which you should tackle?
I guess the key question is who has the right to prioritize and who prioritizes? In many parts of the world, the right to go from one part of the country to the other, to live in a city or live in another one, to practice your profession, is a fundamental right. In other places, it's a little bit more restricted. In China, for example, till very recently, the urban hukou was a very big thing. So somebody in a rural area could not actually come to a city except as a migrant. They didn't have the same rights, and that's a historical thing that's actually changing. Hopefully, very significantly as we speak. So I guess the key thing is, who has the right to do this, and B, what would we do with a city where everybody is just like each other? In fact, the whole thing about the process of urbanization, it's not only the last century and a half or 2 centuries. If you look at the last 5,000 years of urbanization, the most productive, the most interesting, the most culturally diverse centers are places where people from across the world and from multiple cultures, languages actually met, and that collision of ideas, of cultures, of ways of living, of ways of thinking and thinking is really what produces the hybrid vigor of cities. And if you actually sanitize that and everybody look like each other and just like each other, then I guess it will not be only boring, but I do suspect it will be highly unproductive. So at least there would be an economic argument to have a much more diversity. Apart from the fact that each one of us is quite different, and given the range of cultures that we have, if we have a free range of expression, we're able to really find the best things that cities can provide to us.
Find a few questions. Anantakrishnan asked, billions of dollars are being spent on urban transport infrastructure in India. Is there sufficient planning, public consultation before committing to such expenditure? What are the global best practices?
Well, I guess the answer is no. There's not enough public consultation and other processes involved. Of course, for a country of India's size and the scale of the cities, I would say we are underinvested in terms of infrastructure. We are underinvested by not 1 or 2 or 3, but maybe a few hundred% in some cases. So we do need a lot more infrastructure. There's no question about that. Like we dealt with earlier, whether we choose a particular form of transportation infrastructure versus the other is a serious question. Does every million city have to have a metro system? Especially because we know that metro systems across the world are not viable, excepting maybe in Hong Kong and Tokyo, where the densities are very high. So that means that somebody's got to subsidize it. So there are these questions of public policy and what is good and who's going to pay for whatever it is, which need to be looked at rather carefully. But one of the big challenges that we have across the world, especially in the global south, is the limited or let's say underinvestment in infrastructure, and infrastructure that enables access. Transportation itself is not it's not an end in itself. Transportation exists to enable people to do what they want to do and to enable economic activity and a whole lot of things to happen. But when it becomes an end to itself, when it becomes a subject of vanity or a political leader who wants to have something grand and smart to show people, eventually many of those things run around that. The history of cities is also about the history of bad ideas, and including transportation systems which get replaced, which left behind. And if you're locked into a system that doesn't work, you can be sure that somewhere down the line, your city is not going to be the nicest place to live in, or may not be competitive, may not have a vibrant economy, and the center of the global car industry for many decades, Detroit, going through a very, very serious crisis, even though it was a place that produced much of a particular form of urbanism.
How do you see current developmental trends like impact investment in smart cities as an approach to implement SDGs in our cities?
Well, I'm not sure that impact investment is doing well in too many places, and certainly not in smart cities. I'm not sure particularly what we're talking about. Obviously, you need investment in things that spur innovation. Smart cities are a particular form of innovation which may work in some contexts and not in others. Much of what we see in terms of infrastructure and technology, which drives urban innovation, has come from particular forms of impact investment. So, if you look at the development of, let's say, electric light and the production of electricity in different parts of the world in the late 19th century, it was about particular sets of investors taking huge risks, some of them going bankrupt in some senses, and others making huge amount of resources in some ways, and actually sort of built out that infrastructure. But once that breakthrough is made, I guess the big question is, how does a particular technical system or a social system or an innovation actually permeate not only through the large urban centers, which occupy imagination because we see them on television or the media sort of, constructs it and puts it right in front of our eyes, and that is how does it go through that entire system of settlements that we're talking about? How does it reach, let's say, universal access to power supply, or let's say renewable energy, which is what SDG 6 is all about. How do we make sure that pretty much every place in the country where it's viable and possible has good, clean, renewable energy, which is not producing emissions at one end, but is providing the basic services that you have, so that everybody doesn't have to depend on incandescent lamps. You can use LED lighting, which is like 1/20th or maybe 1/50th of the energy consumption that you use if you use the incandescent bulb. Those are the kind of questions that I think we should be looking at, especially when we're looking at impact investment, because it's about making these sort of factor for significant shifts that will enable us to move much more quickly than we are on the path to greater sustainability.
Our final question for tonight. Do you think the concepts of circular economy and steady-state economy are ever going to be applicable to the cities or urban areas that are highly dynamic in terms of structure and processes?
So if I look at the steady-state economy, the idea of the steady-state economy actually comes from an analysis of global systems. Right? So you look at the world, and that's what our daily our friend looked at when he first wrote this paper and the book in the 1970s, because the Earth is a semi-closed system. For many things, it's a closed system, right? And obviously, in a closed system, if something grows very rapidly, it's going to displace a lot of other things. If it happens to be a species of hominids called people or human beings, then it creates problems for the rest of the biosphere. But eventually, it comes back to bite them. So you can't grow infinitely in a steady state or semi-open system forever. So that's where that idea comes from. Now, obviously, in economies that have grown very significantly, where there's a tremendous amount of asset wealth and things like that, there's a discussion happening for some time now about the process of degrowth, because there was this idea of coupling, growth, development, and quality of life. And I guess what we found after a number of mistakes in dealing with in economic development, while old people in many places, or at least traditional cultures, will tell you this without even having to go through those mistakes, is that you can actually live a high quality of life without necessarily having all the things that completely destroy or pollute your environment, or make put a burden on you to work in particular ways and do certain things for many places. So this is an interesting question in terms of urban structure, because cities in some senses are distributive systems. So they draw on resources from other places, they produce a tremendous amount of value addition, and because of that, they can concentrate all these activities and this productivity. The challenge with that is that you can't do that forever. Right? There are actual limits, and we are finding limits in the biosphere in very simple things like climate change. If you continue to put out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the way that you do, it's natural that the climate will change. And if you just happen to have a large proportion of the global population, 30–40%, living in areas that are either drought-prone or exposed to floods, because many large cities are next to rivers, or they happen to be next to the sea coast, you can be sure that if you keep doing this inevitably and continuously for a long period of time, you're going to have some serious consequences. There are going to be hundreds of millions of people who are going to be displaced. The urban economy is going to be dislodged and disruptive. And we're going to go through cycles that we've seen before. You have to go to many parts of the world to see the wrecks and the ruins of many cities, because they've not respected their need to balance their own productivity and their own hybrid vigor that I talked about earlier with the resource space that they need, and also respect the need for people who live in them or live outside them to live an adequate life. inequality is a great killer. That's brought down more empires and more urban areas than maybe environmental changes has in the past. But that's no guarantee that it won't happen. So, I mean, we'll be dealing with all of these questions and more over the next few weeks, and we hope we can engage you with a very active dialogue. The wonderful thing about this particular course is it has people from the last time we ran it 100 different countries, so the opportunity for dialogue between yourselves, between different contexts in different cities, to learn from each other and to hear from some of the more engaged people in the world who work on these kind of questions is quite immense. I mean, we really enjoy this, and most of us learn tremendously from your questions. And as we proceed from the kind of solutions and the things that you're trying to do in your context, that give us a lot of inspiration of how we can make change in the world. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you, and we'll be back soon. Keep going with the course.
Right. So this will wrap up this webinar. For those of you whose questions weren't reviewed today, please, we encourage you to post it on the discussion forum or write to us at cities@sdgacademy.org, and we will forward it to the respective instructors, or we will try to address it. And thank you so much for tuning in and for interesting questions. You will find the recording of this webinar on the weekly webinar tab. It will come up in a couple of days, so stay tuned for that. And we'll see you again next week, next Thursday. We'll keep you updated on that. See you and good night.